This married couple, who were soon to get divorced, found themselves trapped in a strange loop deep within the forest where they began seeing their own duplicates. The story begins with Jane, a woman out for her morning walk. She has a husband named Dan, who keeps following her around, even though she's made it clear that she doesn't want him near her. Jane can't stand being with him anymore. Too many bad things have happened between them, and she's decided that divorce is the only way out. Dan, exhausted but still following her, stops by a lake. Neither of them notices the warning signs posted before entering the forest, signs they chose to ignore, marking the beginning of something dangerous. After arguing with Dan, Jane storms off, still angry about his behavior the previous night. They had attended a party where Dan got drunk, acted rudely, and even flirted with other women. That was one of the final reasons Jane wanted to leave him. Although Dan apologized, Jane wasn't ready to forgive him. She walked ahead, leaving him behind. As she continued walking, she saw a strange man near the lake, but ignored him and kept moving. The forest had a jogging trail where many people used to run, so she continued her walk there. Meanwhile, Dan began hearing strange noises that hurt his ears, forcing him to cover them. Jane heard the same sound moments later, but soon everything went quiet, and both thought it was just their imagination. A while later, Jane returned to the lake only to find Dan missing. Concerned, she called out for him, unaware that Dan had wandered deeper into the woods. The inner part of the forest was filled with broken objects scattered around, as if someone had been there before and destroyed everything. Dan suddenly felt like someone was watching him, but when he checked, no one was there. Soon after, Jane found Dan and told him she wanted to show him something important. They walked together toward the river area, where Jane pointed at a sign and explained that no matter which path she took, she always ended up back at the same spot. Dan realized the same thing. When he completed his first round, he somehow ended up at the lake again. Jane grew increasingly uneasy, realizing they couldn't find a way out. She urged Dan to follow her as they tried a different path, hoping it would lead them out of the forest, but it didn't. Once again, they ended up at the river. Now, panic began to set in. They were trapped. No matter which direction they went, they couldn't escape the loop. Jane, growing desperate, listened as Dan suggested that they split up and take different routes to cover more ground. Thinking it might help them find a way out faster, she agreed, and the two decided to divide and search separately. Before they split up, Dan apologized to Jane. He tried to tell her that he had made many mistakes but still loved her just as much as before. Jane didn't pay much attention to his emotional words and walked away on her own path. Dan took the opposite direction, hoping they might find a way out. Neither of them realized they were trapped in a loop from which no one had ever escaped. As they continued walking, Jane ended up right back at the same place, the river by the boat. After waiting a while, Dan appeared there too, and they bumped into each other again. Jane thought Dan was playing some kind of trick to scare her, but even he was confused about what was happening. They both stood quietly, staring at the "No Swimming" sign ahead of them. By now, they had circled the area more than 5 times, always ending up at the same spot. Dan noticed how dirty the pond was and questioned why there would be a "No Swimming" sign when no one would ever want to swim in such filthy water. Jane also began to wonder what the real reason could be. Trying to act brave, Dan walked up to pull the sign out of the ground, but it was deeply embedded and wouldn't budge. Realizing it was pointless, Jane took out her phone to try contacting someone for help. Her earphones fell to the ground as she discovered there was no signal at all, no network, no service, nothing. Dan's phone had the same problem. The two started wandering around, searching for any area with coverage. That was the moment when both of them began to lose patience. They walked all over the forest with their phones in hand, desperately trying to find a signal. Suddenly, they saw something ahead, the same hooded man they had glimpsed earlier. He was standing silently in the middle of the path, staring at them. Terrified, Dan and Jane ran as fast as they could. They were panicking now, confused by how that man could appear in one place and then somewhere else moments later. When they finally stopped running, they realized they had returned to the same "No Swimming" sign once again. As Jane looked down, she noticed her earphones on the ground, but there were 2 pairs now, even though she had only brought 1. That's when she started suspecting Dan of playing a prank on her, maybe trying to cheer her up after how embarrassed she felt the night before because of his behavior. But Dan insisted he had nothing to do with any of it, that everything she was experiencing was happening to him too. Realizing he might be telling the truth, Jane's fear grew even stronger. Whatever was happening wasn't Dan's fault, something else was going on here, something they couldn't understand. Their fear reached the next level as they decided to run again, heading in random directions, hoping to break free. The only thought haunting them was to not end up back at the same spot again. But in situations like these, when someone is caught in a repeating loop and keeps returning to the same place, there's usually some kind of clue hidden within it. They just needed to figure it out. Still, since they were in a dense forest, Jane thought they should try a different approach, like climbing a tall tree to see from above which direction had fewer trees, hoping that might lead them toward an exit. That meant the flat land they were looking for had to be somewhere in that direction, and reaching it might be their safest option. They needed to pick one direction and keep moving straight without turning back. Maybe someone had deliberately created this loop to trap anyone who entered it. And if that still didn't work, they could try setting something on fire, creating as much smoke as possible until someone noticed it. Since it was daytime, the best plan was to start a fire that produced thick black smoke, which usually came from burning dry leaves scattered all over the forest floor. They could gather those leaves, burn them, and use the rising smoke to form a large visible signal. Combining all these steps could form a smart technique to escape the loop. But Dan and Jane were so consumed by their personal conflicts that they couldn't focus on anything else. Exhausted, they decided to stop and rest. Jane, frustrated and on edge, looked around the forest. Suddenly, she heard that same strange ringing sound again, the one she'd heard before they got trapped here. She told Dan about it, and he confirmed that he could hear it too. He suggested that they should follow the direction of the sound and see where it led. But Jane shouted angrily, blaming him for everything, saying that if he hadn't distracted her, she might have already found a way out. Her words made it clear she no longer respected Dan. She scolded him harshly, and Dan felt deeply hurt. He only wanted to assure her that no matter what happened, he would always stand by her side. But Jane made it painfully clear that she didn't want to be with him anymore. She told him there was someone else in her life now, someone she wanted to spend her future with. Hearing that broke Dan completely. After all his sacrifices for her, she was now choosing another man so easily. After some silence, Dan finally accepted the truth and said that once they got out of this place, they would go through with the divorce. He mentioned that his family didn't know about any of this yet, but he'd tell them later. For now, he chose a random direction and told Jane they should keep moving that way. They walked as fast as they could, but the result was the same. They ended up right back where they started, in front of the same lake and no swimming sign. Jane began to panic, crying loudly, while Dan started laughing in disbelief, saying, "We're back here again." No matter where they ran, every path led them back to the exact same place. Jane and Dan sat near the lake, completely shaken and unsure of what to do next. They knew they had to try something to escape this place. As they sat there, they suddenly heard a strange voice telling them to run away, but no one was visible around. Jane was in pain from her injured leg and lay down while Dan tried to find where the voice was coming from. Both of them struggled to get up and followed the sound, hoping the person shouting might help them get out of there. They moved deeper into the forest, where they saw the same hooded figure walking away, his movements more disturbed than before. They decided to follow him. A moment later, they saw the man standing ahead with his back turned. Even after repeatedly calling out, he didn't respond. Dan threw a few stones at him, but there was no reaction. Then Jane nervously walked up and lightly touched him, but he remained motionless, which terrified them even more. They had so many questions. Who was he, what was he doing there, and why did he keep appearing in the same place? Suddenly, another hooded man passed right in front of them, his face also hidden. When they tried to catch him, the first hooded figure turned around, and to Dan's shock, the man's face looked exactly like his own, like a perfect duplicate. Jane was stunned too, but before she could process what was happening, another man wearing the same hoodie appeared silently behind her and stabbed her to death. Dan watched in horror as Jane died right in front of him. He wanted to save her but was too terrified to fight back. Scared for his own life, Dan ran away, knowing the attackers were armed and might kill him next. He didn't stop running until he collided with a stranger wearing the exact same clothes as him. When he fell to the ground, there was no one around, only eerie voices echoing his name, urging him to run. Dan thought he was hallucinating, but the whispers surrounded him from all directions. Shaken, he ignored them and kept moving forward. His head was pounding from the fear and confusion. After wandering for a while, he found himself back at the same lake, the one that seemed to be part of a loop. The most shocking thing happened when he suddenly ran into Jane, alive and completely unharmed, even though he had just seen her die. Jane looked at him and asked, "You already finished your first loop? How did you come back so soon?" Dan, utterly confused, stepped back and asked her to wait while he went behind the trees to catch his breath. He could barely breathe and felt a sharp pain in his chest. Everything happening around him felt terrifying, almost like being trapped in a nightmare. He had witnessed Jane's brutal death, yet now she stood before him without a single injury, alive as if nothing had ever happened. For now, after trying to make himself a little comfortable, Dan walked straight toward Jane. He didn't want to appear as if he wasn't taking the situation seriously. Jane was already extremely frustrated with him, and because of his behavior, she was planning to divorce him soon. Yet even in that moment, despite everything, Dan remained confused. He just kept staring at Jane. For the moment, Dan told Jane that they should look for another way to get out of this place. However, this version of Dan already knew what was going to happen next, which is why he was trying to understand the situation before making a move. He didn't tell Jane anything about the upcoming events. Jane, on the other hand, was fully cooperating with him now, and as they began to move forward, they ended up circling back to the same pond area. A "no swimming" sign was posted right in front of them. Dan again questioned who would even want to swim in such a dirty pond, yet there was still a warning sign there. Jane casually replied that maybe someone might jump in if it got too hot, even if the water was dirty or filled with snakes. As Jane stepped a little further ahead, she noticed an earphone lying on the ground. She was a bit shocked because she had an identical pair in her own pocket. She couldn't figure out where the second one came from since no one else had been seen in this area since they arrived. Dan noticed that because of the harsh sunlight, Jane's skin was beginning to burn, so they either had to go deeper into the forest to avoid the sun or try to contact someone who could rescue them. Dan kept trying but couldn't get any network signal at all. There was no coverage in that area. As they went deeper into the forest, Jane stopped for a moment. Dan tried to reassure her, saying they would eventually find a way out. They just needed to stick together, and if they made it out, they would never separate again. Jane was surprised because Dan had never spoken so seriously before. Suddenly, a man appeared from behind and hit Dan on the head with a stick, knocking him unconscious. It turned out that the attacker was Dan's duplicate, who then stepped aside and started vomiting. The real Dan lay motionless on the ground. The duplicate Dan ordered Jane to quickly remove the unconscious Dan's clothes, saying he had discovered something important that she needed to know. Poor Jane couldn't understand what was happening, so she did exactly as the duplicate instructed. She took off the unconscious Dan's hoodie and wore it herself. The duplicate Dan looked dizzy but insisted that they had to do this to survive. A few moments later, when the real Dan started to regain consciousness, the duplicate said firmly that they had to kill him, only then would they understand the loop. Jane immediately followed his command and struck him with the stick, killing him. She believed the Dan who had passed out was actually an imposter, as his behavior and seriousness had seemed unusually strange. Afterward, the duplicate Dan took Jane far away from that spot. Both of them were confused, but this Dan seemed to know more. They sat by a tree and waited for a while. After drinking some water, they could see their earlier versions walking in the distance, the same versions who had first arrived here. Hiding behind the tree, Dan and Jane realized that their clones ahead had no idea they were about to be trapped in the loop. Everything was interconnected. Seeing his own clone up close shocked Dan completely. The clones continued walking ahead, and from behind the tree, Dan whispered that maybe they should follow them. But Jane snapped at him, saying he wasn't going anywhere. She didn't want to take any more risks that might bring them face to face with another version of themselves. What terrified Jane the most was that dangerous version of Dan who always stood there silently, wearing a hoodie. Here, Dan tells Jane something else, that there might be many versions of themselves in this place, and some of these versions could have died in animal attacks or car accidents. Their deaths could happen in various ways, but the loop would simply restart. Hearing this, Jane became extremely frustrated, and her head was throbbing. She tried to calm herself but soon began overthinking, wondering if some alien civilization was influencing the situation and that's why they were trapped in this loop. No one could remember a way out. Suddenly, they heard noises again, and when they looked up, they saw that their newer versions had arrived. The loop was continuing relentlessly. The other versions began fighting each other over trivial matters. Seeing her version, Jane asked Dan if they looked too attractive to others. Dan reassured her, saying that no matter the circumstances, he had always liked her. Despite the initial fighting, love began to emerge between the other versions, and they realized that perhaps only the best versions could escape the loop, while cruel and dangerous ones killed each other. The same thing happened with other versions. Another Dan appeared and killed the earlier ones. Behind the tree, this all seemed like common knowledge to Dan and Jane. They moved farther away, trying to understand each other and live calmly. By now, both were extremely hungry, having walked for hours with zero food intake. Shockingly, since entering the forest, they hadn't seen a single animal, insect, or bird. How they would survive under these conditions was unknown. With no food or water, their minds began to deteriorate, and Jane became irritable, realizing she couldn't spend her future life with Dan. She told him clearly that she might go ahead with the divorce. Dan grew sad hearing this, but he reminded himself that they needed to focus on getting out first. He didn't want their dangerous version to appear and attack them, meaning they had to confront that version before anything else. As they discussed and moved forward, no path appeared. They ended up circling back to the pond area. The scorching sun had fried Jane's brain, leaving her frustrated. Dan comforted her, hugging her tightly and saying that if they stayed together, everything would be fine. Perhaps all of this was a test of how they would spend their lives going forward. Dan acted maturely, holding the distressed Jane to his chest. Jane began to calm down, and they felt drawn to each other. They kissed, a feeling reminiscent of the early days of their marriage. They realized they couldn't live without each other. Dan promised that no matter what happened, he would never leave her, and Jane seemed to reconsider her plan for divorce. A sense of cautious optimism had just begun to take root in their minds when something unusual caught their attention. Right at the very edge of the pond, partially hidden in the shadows, stood a black tent. Both Dan and Jane approached it slowly, their steps deliberate and careful, fully aware that their most dangerous versions could be lurking inside, waiting to strike. Every instinct screamed caution. As they peered closer, the inside of the tent revealed a horrifying scene, multiple earphones scattered across the floor, all smeared with dark, dried blood. Among them lay a phone, Dan's own phone, but its contents were disturbing. The device contained dozens of photographs, none of which they had ever taken themselves. Dan's heart sank as the realization hit him. This was the lair of their dangerous versions. Here, there would be no mercy, no chance of escape. The loop was unbreakable, and anyone who entered this place would be doomed. Desperation and fear surged through them, but Dan tried to provide some comfort, telling Jane again, with urgency and love in his voice, that he cared for her more than anything. Yet, before they could process this moment, a figure emerged from the shadows, a hooded man, the dangerous version of Dan. Without warning, he attacked the real Dan, striking him relentlessly until he collapsed, motionless. Jane could barely watch as the violence unfolded, and in sheer terror, she tried to flee. But fate was cruel. Another version of Jane appeared from behind, catching her and brutally killing her. This second version of Jane then began to wait patiently, her eyes scanning for the next unsuspecting victim. Meanwhile, the hooded Jane, desperate to survive, leapt into the water, fighting to escape the relentless threat. She knew that somewhere, another version was lying in wait, ready to strike. Struggling against the current, she swam toward the rocky shoreline, finally spotting a silver-colored ball glinting in the distance, a potential clue, or perhaps another trap. But before she could react, a reflection in the water revealed movement behind her. Another figure had arrived, and this Jane was struck down. Her lifeless body was dragged into the forest, toward a section of the tent where Dan's dangerous version sat. The sight was nightmarish. He was literally devouring the bodies of other versions, a gruesome display of cannibalistic survival. Meanwhile, the original versions of Dan and Jane, the ones who had somehow learned to survive within the deadly loop, sat together, watching in stunned silence. Their calm, measured approach contrasted starkly with the chaos around them. It was clear that these were the first versions to truly understand the mechanics of the loop, learning not only to survive its horrors but to navigate them with strategy and awareness. The scene underscored the absolute danger of this place. No mercy, no escape, only the brutal law of survival, and the horrifying realization that their other selves had been turned into predators in a never-ending cycle of violence. It was now painfully clear, there was absolutely no way for them to escape the loop. Their other versions were being mercilessly hunted, killed, and consumed, having transformed completely into ruthless, cannibalistic versions of themselves. Each act of violence reinforced the brutal reality of the loop, survival at any cost, with no chance of mercy, escape, or reprieve. The forest, the pond, the tents, it all formed a nightmarish arena where the cycle repeated endlessly, claiming every weaker or careless version. What would happen to them next, how long this terrifying journey would continue, or if there was any hope at all, remained a mystery. The story, for now, comes to a chilling end, leaving only questions and a haunting sense of dread.